Tonight, we're going to hear about a man who started off on noble footing, yet whose moral compass became compromised, nevertheless, and his reputation was later crushed, deservedly so. And, it's another one of those stories of a philatelic bad guy. And I enjoy talking about the good guys and the bad guys. I found that these fellows are usually really exciting to learn about. I mean, that's why there's a lot of cop shows on TV, right? Thanks to the bad guys. And I'm always amazed at the denial that these crooks exhibit when they're eventually caught. And the subject in tonight's talk went to outrageously extraordinary lengths to try to convince people that he was just a good guy with an honest heart. And yet the facts eventually proved he was just another swindler of his time, whose narrative of his tarnished life eventually became legend. So let's get started. And some of this might overlap with what Paul's nice introduction shared. And I'll begin by noting that my passion, as he said, is to read old stamp journals. I just love them. And the American Philatelic Research Library, or the APRL in Bellefonte, has the world's largest selection of reference works. It's absolutely terrific. And I try to visit there, as I said, about once a year for several days or a week. And like many fellows here in this Zoom meeting, I'm an APS member. And one of the benefits of membership is the privilege of checking out up to 5 journals a month from the APRL. And I've been doing that nonstop for the past dozen years. And since I started work on my first book there that Paul showed. Oh. And my favorite philatelic magazines to read are from the 1880s and 1890s. These are some bound journals from the APRL. And I want to say that back then, there were hundreds of stamp journals published each month. This 1893 Popular Monthly reported that there had been over 400 journals published to date. And I can tell you there would be several hundred more before the end of the century. Remember, there was no internet or television or radio or film back then. So people's leisure time was frequently spent reading, and the amount of written material on all subjects, not just stamps, that was available to enjoy was really staggering. And later on, beginning around 1905, many enjoyed sharing picture postcards that they either bought or received in the mail from friends or family. And it was common for homes to have postcards in a wooden box or on a table in their living area, which they would pass around and enjoy together. So let's put things into context here. For me, while going through numerous stamp journals of the 1890s, I would frequently see ads over and over from some of the same active stamp dealers. Here's Henry Grimmel. He was a well-known Nassau Street dealer. Of course, John Scott and Scott Stamp and Coin on the lower right. E.F. Gams of San Francisco. And one of my buddies, William B. Hale of Hubbardston, Massachusetts, Williamsville, Massachusetts. He advertised a lot. And just like today,
So,
when we read American
philosophy, with anything,
when we read our popular stamp magazines of today, the American Philatelist or Lynn Stamp News or other stamp magazines, we see a lot of ads from the same entities again and again, right? Well, back then, one of the fellows that I kept seeing ads from over and over and over, along with various mentions, was named Georges Carion, which made me really curious about who was this fellow. And by the way, please forgive my pronunciation. I only got average grades in junior high French class, although I did have a couple really good friendly teachers. But anyhow, Carion was born in Paris in April 1858. And one account mentions that at age 12, Georges was handling important matters. And while in college at age 18, he began collecting stamps. In 1879, at the age of 21, he and a fellow named Jules Emden established the firm of Carion and Emden in Paris. And the company became known for their extensive Bolivian philatelic stock and French colonies material. They touted Carion's superior knowledge of those French stamps, and check out all the offerings on the left side of this ad, those French colonies. Georges was also publisher of two stamp journals in France, Bulletin Mensuel, which is roughly translated the monthly bulletin of novelties. That came out in 1884, and L'Entomologie, roughly translates the study of stamps, came out a year later. Yet the business began flourishing enough, and through extensive promotion, they just ran ads relentlessly. So Carion's involvement as an editor, reportedly to his regret, came to an end. This is an ad from 1888 from a chemist's newsletter. There was real wide variety of advertisements in this newsletter, and this one noted that Carion and Emden did wholesale, retail, and consignment business. They also handled rare stamps of all kinds. It asked collectors to mail in their want lists to, quote, receive their care. And all prices were in French francs. Languages spoken were French, English, German, and Dutch. And I believe I found this not at the APRL, but many of the images that I can uncover come from newspapers.com. And it takes a little more digging, but I certainly love that site. So this is an ad from the same year, 1888, which is printed in English, as you can see. And I want you to note the very first item offered there from Cochin, China. Remember that. It's a French colonies, and this is from 1888. At that time, Carion was trusted by collectors, and he was well known from his wide-ranging advertising. And this 1889 notice is from a general paper and stated that the company bought collections and sold rare stamps. And sometime after that, Jules Emden left Paris and he moved to San Francisco. So Georges set out on his own and he began marketing himself as a stamp expert. And like many others who offered their services as skilled philatelic professionals for a fee, he affixed his expertising mark to the back of stamps that people sent in. And he offered this service for many, many years. As you can see, these say G. Carion, Paris. So this was quite a common thing done there. And a little while later, success allowed Carion to move to Tahiti for a bit. And that is likely where he first lost his way. He eventually disappeared from the landscapes there over the problem of some forged overprint stamps. Now, this is a series from 1893. And as you can see, there's several varieties of the overprints. And the overprints on everything except the upper right-hand stamp is in the Scott's catalog. So I sense maybe that could be a fake possibly created by Georges. Here are some stamps from Tahiti, which are being offered online currently as Carion forgeries. It's a partial cover with part of his last name showing there. And if you look closely, the three overprints on this intact strip of three stamps are all in different positions. And, you know, you'd assume that legitimate overprint stamps would reflect some kind of quality control and be a bit more uniform. But anyway, one thing that can be noted is that today, Carion's phony stamps are quite collectible, and many online offerings have prices of up to $200 a piece. Well, either things got too hot for Georges in Tahiti, or he was ready for a fresh start. So he left the South Pacific Islands and moved to San Francisco, where he settled in for around 6 years ago. I have not been able to find out whether he connected with Jules Emden or not. I'd love to know one way or another. And I dug pretty deeply to find out exactly when Carion made the move to California, yet there's not a lot of material to provide an exact time frame. One source said he moved in 1893. Several others said 1894. But Carion's first ad in the monthly Philatelic Facts and Fallacies, that was San Francisco's stamp journal, that was December 1893, and it had a San Francisco P.O. box address. So my sense is that's likely the year that he moved to San Francisco from Tahiti. The earliest Carion cover from San Francisco that I've found is postmarked July 16, 1894, That's the one on the top. And you can see that it has a rubber stamp corner card on it. And the bottom example, sent 5 days later, showed off his new rubber stamp with Philatelic Expert on it. And I imagine he would eventually have business envelopes printed with his return address on them, wouldn't you think? Yet that hadn't happened by November of 1894, since this cover, sent around Thanksgiving time, still had the rubber stamped return address on it. By the way, that P.O. box number would be his mailing address during his entire time in San Francisco. His business was here in room 10 at 318 Kearney Street, near the corner of Pine Street. And that's actually just a few blocks from where Chinatown is today, if you visit to San Francisco. The December 1894 issue of the Philatelic Californian had a lot of Carion content, including a full-page ad specifically seeking out want lists and French stamps. There was editorial content noting that he'd set up an exhibit with a complete set of 1879 Romanian stamps, which included blocks of 4 and imperfect versions. That same journal included a feature that Georges wrote on the stamps of St. Marie Island of Madagascar, and a large generic display ad was included in that same December 1894 issue. Carion had a full-page advertisement on the back cover of the journal, and there was a half-page biography inside with a distinctive photo of Georges, helping readers become more familiar with him. Carion set down roots in the Bay Area, and he became high-profile and active again in philatelic circles, both locally and nationally. And check out this part of his full-page ad, which notes Carion's involvement in numerous philatelic associations. He was actually active in many other societies as well, like the American Philatelic Press Association. He was an officer of a number of those organizations too. Georges was vice president of the Colombian Philatelic Society, vice president of the League of American Philatelists, vice president of the Canadian Philatelic Association. Now, that suggests that he was held in high esteem in stamp collecting circles and could be trusted. Those involvements certainly lent credibility to him and his business. 1895 seemed to be a very active time for Carion. Here are some really interesting covers, and they illustrate that his reach was truly global. He had printed corner cards by March of 1895. This cover was sent to Kingston, Jamaica. He had different size envelopes too. This one was mailed about a month later to Pittsburgh, and it was rerouted to a hotel in New Orleans, Louisiana. Here's a cover sent to a family member in Paris in September of 1895. It's addressed to Madame Carion. And next is a November 13th, 1895 cover to a very active collector of that era named Hubert Atherton of Holyoke, Massachusetts. And by the way, for those who may have followed another of my passionate collecting interests, Hubert Atherton was also a customer of William B. Hale, another huckster and forger that I've come to enjoy learning about. Anyway, back to Mr. Carion. This is a nice registered cover, postmarked November 15th, 1895, going to Budapest, Hungary. And during that year, Georges did all that he could to expand awareness of his business in San Francisco. Here's one of his many advertisements announcing his activities to the collecting community. And here is one from the November 1895 from the Philatelic Advertiser. The editor of that journal was Herbert Beardsley. That was a prominent name in philatelic circles, as he frequently published dealer directories to connect collectors and dealers. And as you can see, most of Carion's ads at the time had also included an address for him in Paris at 83 Lemercier Street, that little green storefront shown here. That's what it looks like today, thanks to Google and Google Maps. So that's where Georges worked on it. He was also advertising in stamp journals overseas. Here is one of his ads written in French, very similar text, directed to collectors back home. And in August 1895, the Pennsylvania Philatelic published a really nice feature on Carion with that same photo of Georges. And an integral part of the story, which would unfold in coming months, will reflect the connection that Carion had with the philatelic editor and publisher of that journal, Clifford Kissinger. Kissinger was one of the founders of the Sons of Philatelia and then the rival Philatelic Sons of America, where he served as its first president. Clifford was later president of the Society of Philatelic Americans and later also served for a while as secretary of the Publications Committee of the American Philatelic Society. And Kissinger was quite an outspoken and opinionated fellow. He was a real spark plug in the philatelic community who often polarized people. Yet he was instrumental in organizing numerous stamp clubs, and he attracted a lot of young folks to collecting, which is part of why Kissinger was posthumously named to the APS Hall of Fame. He was a big wheel and someone that Carion benefited a lot by knowing. And as an aside, I'd actually love to do a presentation on Clifford Kissinger someday because he too is quite an interesting fellow. Well, it's about to get juicy. Here's a guy, Georges Carion, who was obviously educated, quite well recognized in collecting circles, a fellow who had several service positions, as we saw in philatelic organizations, wrote informative stamp columns, was a high-profile advertiser across the country and in Europe. He was seemingly successful financially, held in high regard, and who at some time made the decision to cross over to the dark side of things and become a forger, a counterfeiter, a thief, a swindler, whatever you want to call it. And to me, it's just wild that somebody would trade in a good reputation for financial gain. And all I can conclude is that that's just the mind of a huckster. But anyway, in early 1895, that's January 25th to be exact, Georges Carion spoke to the Philatelic Society of San Francisco, and he showed some covers that he had received from someone in Cochin, China, which had postage due stamps on them. Remember that 1888 ad, Cochin, China? Now, I want to note that back then, postage due stamps, as we know them today, they were also referred to as unpaid letter stamps. So I may use those two terms interchangeably a little bit here during our talk. Now, something similar to this addressed to him is what he may have showed that Philatelic Society of San Francisco club that night. Carion had been selling what he described as rare provincial postage due stamps. The stamps were diagonally overprinted Cochin Chin in black, and they looked like this. The overprints were on lower denomination black postage due stamps and higher denomination brown postage due stamps. Now, collectors in the United States, they had no compelling reason to doubt the validity of the stamps. It was well known that French colony general issues had widely been overprinted during that era. And at some time, Georges circulated a number of ads just like this, noting that he had, quote, the scarcest unpaid letter stamps in the world. And a few slides ago, we saw that Clifford Kissinger said in his August 1895 stamp journal that Georges Carion is known as one of the most reliable dealers doing business in all parts of the world. Yet French collectors were much more skeptical. They did not believe Carion's claim that the government had overprinted the stamps. An investigation by the Société Française Tombrologie, essentially the French version of the APS, they found no supporting evidence for the overprints, and they condemned the stamps, and they labeled Carion a charlatan and a fraud. And I must say that when researching Georges Carion, my radar really went up when I read that he was unanimously elected to the position at the Philatelic Society of San Francisco as their official counterfeit detector. I mean, that's like having the fox guard the hen house. It was just astounding. But reaction in the United States was somewhat more measured to the accusations, at least initially. Though an extensive executive session at their summer convention in Clayton, New York in 1895, the American Philatelic Association, that's the founding name of the APS, they temporarily suspended him and gave Carion 1 year to clear himself. They essentially said that for him to remain an APA member, he needs to bring absolute proof of the validity of those stamps in question or bring about a legal proceeding which would clear his name. And they decreed that the matter would be revisited at the 1896 APA convention at Lake Minnetonka, Minnesota. Well, Georges vehemently protested the accusations against him, the APA's decision to suspend him for a year, and the details of things were essentially sensational gossip in the stamp journals back then. And Clifford Kissinger came to Carion's defense in 2 fall issues of the Pennsylvania Philatelist. He printed this notice from Georges in the October 1895 issue of the Pennsylvania Philatelist. Carion wanted on record across the land that he had completely and voluntarily addressed the issue. He had numerous members of the philatelic community in San Francisco, along with prominent APA members, vouch for him. And he said that he also provided unquestionable proof of the genuineness of the stamps in question. Overall, Carion was extremely disappointed that the association, in his mind, listened to strangers, meaning the French accusers, rather than his references, who were well known to the APA. Well, Clifford Kissinger continued to help his friend. He was definitely one of the 2 of Carion's best supporters and defenders. In December 1895, Kissinger reprinted the entire positive feature on Georges, which he had run just a couple months earlier in August. And one complimentary sentence was changed to read, quote, "He is a man of great ability, well educated, and has friends and patrons in every part of the globe." I mean, you can't find a much better glowing endorsement than that. And like a lot of other con artists, Carion just kept going, business as usual for him. He kept placing ads all across the country in stamp journals. Here is his March 1896 full-page ad in Kissinger's Pennsylvania Philatelist. He even kept up with collectors by having his name and address appear in Harold Beardsley's Philatelic address book, published to help buyers and sellers connect with each other. And Georges made sure he was represented there. His ad is shown on the right. Collectors would buy these books because essentially they had tons of addresses of dealers as well as other collectors. And this was an easy way for people to send their want list to a number of dealers all at once and let people know of their collecting interests. So these philatelic address books were actually very popular at the time. Now, Georges' mail order business was steady. This register cover likely carried stamps to a collector who I later believe became a Washington diplomat, Mr. John W. Dye. He was active in philately at the time. Now, let's ramp it up a bit. Carion's time in San Francisco the next few years is quite fascinating. It sounds like a tale worthy of TV shows, Dateline and 2020 and stuff like that. Well, Carion failed to clear his name in the 12 months that he'd been given by the APA, and he was expelled from the association in the summer of 1896. Here's a short notice in one journal a few months after the fact. And though Carion was expelled from the American Philatelic Association, he still remained a member of several other organizations which had taken no action at all against him. And Carion had chose to wait out the 1-year APA suspension period, essentially so he could play the victim and mount a vigorous public defense afterwards. But first, he had to defend himself in another matter, this time with the San Francisco Police Department, who had charged him with theft. Havoc was beginning to follow more regularly and catch up with Carion. This article, with a large image of Georges, appeared in the August 6, 1896 edition of the San Francisco Call. It began by saying that the situation was one of the strangest offenses ever brought before local police authorities. And it went on to say that the matter has produced the greatest sensation ever known in philatelic circles. Well, the gist of it was that Carion had an employee for a year and a half. His name was George Schiller, who had quit 5 days before this article came out. And the paper reported that Carion's former helper accused Georges of substituting, of all things, French colony stamps in an approval book sent to Schiller on Carion's behalf from the Scott Stamp and Coin Company in New York. You see, by that time, Georges couldn't receive approvals from Scott's. They didn't trust him. So he asked his helper to request them. Well, after Georges took about $14 worth of stamps from the book and gave it back to his helper, Schiller sensed that a number of the most valuable stamps had been replaced with worthless counterfeits. And Schiller's name was on this approval circuit. So Schiller confronted Carion, who denied the accusation. The assistant quit, and he went right to the police. And officers arrived, and through some fast talking, Carion sealed the approvals in question in a mailer right then so that they could then be sent back to Scott's. A search warrant was then obtained in the hope that the genuine stamps initially sent would show up, yet that didn't materialize. And Schiller threatened to bring charges of embezzlement against Carion. The matter was actually dropped a few weeks later after Georges presented a letter from Scott's that the stamps returned seemed to be what was sent, and that they looked forward to the $14 payment from Carion. And, you know, how interesting to note at the bottom of this that the exonerated stamp dealer, Carion, supposedly took the high road. The newspaper stated that Mr. Carion is inclined to look upon his ex-employee's action in a charitable manner and attributes it to a hallucination. I mean, what a nerve of the guy. Now, before I go on, I think what happened is that when that Carion did trade out some of his fakes in the approval book, when the police came and he put them in the envelope, they left to go get a search warrant. I think that he switched them out with the originals so that when what was sealed in the envelope got sent back to Scott, Carion had actually put the originals received back in there. That's just my hunch as I follow the timeline of that story. But anyway, like before, his old buddy Clifford Kissinger came to the rescue once again, and he published an overview of the those approvals accusation, along with another glowing endorsement of Carion. And the September 1896 issue of the Pennsylvania Philatelist had this full-page back-and-forth feature about how Georges' name was being smeared and he was a victim of character assassination. And, well, with one public outcry against him turned aside, Georges began focusing on restoring his name in philatelic collecting circles regarding the overprinted French colony postage due stamps. Now, it's going to get really good from here, I guarantee. In October 1896, Carion published an account in a journal which described how he had communicated with postmasters in 2 towns in Indochina. And in his letters to them, he asked each postmaster to give an opinion on whether the stamps he enclosed that he had sent to them as examples, whether they had been in use at their post offices. He asked that they return the postmarked stamps by registered mail in the envelopes that he had enclosed. Well, it took some time, yet the postmasters both replied and said the stamps were indeed genuine. Here's one of the 2 original postmaster letters that Carion got back. Now, this handwritten note reads, "Sir, in answer to your favor of March 24th, this would be 1896, the previous spring, I have the honor to inform you that the 4 unpaid letter stamps annexed, which Carion had provided, are absolutely genuine, and that they still have legal circulation in Indochina. Yours truly, Prams." And Georges felt that this document would clear his name and reinstate his good reputation. And it was delivered to Carion in this cover, postmarked May 28, 1896. That's the same day that the handwritten letter was dated. And a month after Carion's letter and cover were shown in the public, late summer, maybe early fall, Clifford Kissinger provided a Carion update in his November issue of the Pennsylvania Philatelist. Note that he wrote that Philatelists not acquainted of Mr. Carion should be informed of his perfect reliability. Kissinger also stated that the French Philatelic Society, who had brought the charges, to the public in the first place, had gone out of existence. But I can tell you that records from that time are sparse, but it is a definite fact that people who were members of that society were still active in France in supporting and substantiating their initial claims of fraud against Carion, as we'll see in a minute. Now, several city directories from the 1890s have Carion entries. The top one shown here is San Francisco's 1897 directory, and it notes that his business location on Kearny Street. The bottom entry is from Oakland's 1899 directory, and that has his home address at 1621 Broadway. I can't be sure yet. Georges may not have been too interested in showing up for work at his San Francisco office due to the negative public attention that he'd been attracting. And maybe he just didn't want to cross the bay simply to get his mail. He was still doing mail order, as this cover attests, yet it's interesting that he crossed out his P.O. box address on covers that he provided to customers and hand wrote his Oakland address on Broadway, which is in Alameda County. He did that for a while, maybe until there was more time between him and his troubles. And this registered mail examples from June of 1897, as is this cover from 9 days later. And he was still doing this throughout that whole summer. Now, this registered cover to Georges is dated September 15, 1897, and he was still following that practice in 1898, as this cover with a May 15th, 1898 date on it shows. Now, backtracking a year or so, Georges would experience another public tornado when two stamp journals, the American Journal of Philately and the Post Office, ran detailed investigative content in that summer of 1897. They horribly tarnished Carion's reputation further. Henry Grimmel, remember we saw one of his ads there in the 1890s? He was a very well-known Nassau Street stamp dealer with a great reputation. He was also publisher of the Post Office. I actually came across this name because he had given the name of William B. Hale as a reference for APA membership before Hale turned crazy. And so anyway, Henry Grimmel's name carried some weight. He was publisher of the Post Office Journal, and in that 1897 issue in July, Grimmel printed several jabs at Georges, which plainly supported the idea that Carion was a fraud. And one sentence in particular was quite damaging. Carion has written numerous letters to our publisher to get himself into a better position, but Mr. Grimmel was altogether too shrewd a man to be caught by him. And in response to the publication of Carion's postmaster correspondence about those stamps in question a month or so before, Grimmel harshly discounted the letter from the postmasters along with Georges' request to have the stamps authenticated. Grimmel stressed that the burden of proof rested with Carion, and Grimmel also reported that the French stamp agency was still very aggressively investigating the matter while requesting a follow-up investigation. The other journal back then, the American Journal of Philately's story, theirs was headlined "The False Surcharges of Mr. Georges Carion," while "New Light in Cochin, China, Unpaid Letter Stamps" was the story's title in Henry Grimmel's Post Office Journal. The article laid out pretty much everything that seemed to refute all of Carion's explanations. It was quite an in-depth feature with great content, actually, from Europe. Here it is. It's an amazing read. It noted that the French Stamp Society's, Société Française Timbrologie magazine, Revue Philatelic, had published an interesting letter to the organization's secretary. This would be like the APS secretary getting a letter. And the correspondence came from the Minister of Colonies. And it was printed in the article there, along with the quantity of postage due stamps, which were legitimately overprinted. That's these figures up here. And the letter essentially said that the Minister of Colonies had read the initial letter from Georges, to the Cochin postmaster. It mentioned that the minister had also read the replies to Carion from the postmaster, stating that the stamps received were genuine, and the minister concluded that the letters were indisputably authentic. So all of this seemed to tilt these scales in the favor of Georges. Yet the secretary of the French Stamp Society had also asked the Minister of Colonies for an opinion of the overprints themselves, as well as some more background. And the minister's reply quite conclusively provided damaging information about Carion. The words, "The office of Cochinchina has never surcharged unpaid letter stamps with the name of the colony." The conclusion of the French Stamp Society closed out with the expose with the damning phrase, "Nothing could be clearer or more concise," and added that the unpaid letter stamps surcharge Cochinchine offered by Mr. Georges Carion of San Francisco and other places are not only false or fake, but they never existed. So how could Carion have received letters from two postmasters who both vouched for overprinted stamps that Carion had mailed to them? Well, it was postulated by French collectors that Carion had actually mailed the postmasters standard stamps without overprints on them, which is what prompted them to authenticate the stamps that they saw. Then, upon receipt of that mail, the French suggested that Carion had steamed open the letters, applied the overprints himself, and resealed them. So, can you believe this? Later, in front of a local philatelic fraternity in San Francisco, Carion opened the letters to prove his case and his innocence. I mean, what incredible lengths this guy went to in order to deceive people and attempt to preserve his reputation. Just amazing. So, in the end, at least with regard to this matter, it seems that the truth had come out. Now, that story came from the Society of Indochina Philatelists, by the way. And yet, like today's world, it can sometimes take time for public opinions to shift. And Carion's friend Clifford Kissinger came to Georges' defense a couple times in the fall of 1897. He gave him prime advertising space, too, in the September issue, where Georges emphasized, look in the middle here, genuine trade of Cochinchine unpaid letter stamps. And Kissinger also publicized that familiar picture of Carion, along with a blurb that vouched for the accused, where he said, "Mr. Carion should have the benefit of the doubt, and he has many friends. Some of them are working very hard for a conclusive vindication of the foregoing charges." All right, well, in 1897, the October issue of the Virginia Philatelist joined the conversation in favor of Georges, declaring that the postmaster letters were legitimate proof to vindicate Carion. They closed that opinion piece by stating, "Shall we credit the sworn statements of prominent members of the American Philatelic Association, or possibly erroneous report of a foreign society?" And the following month, they were even more critical of those overseas collectors. "Those French are disgusting epicures. They are now devouring Carion." And I got to tell you, as a side note, it was interesting to uncover that Georges sued the editor of the French Society's journal for 25,000 francs for damages because of the Carion stories that they published. And that's the equivalent of about $500,000 today. And that case was actually delayed for years and years. When it was finally adjudicated in March of 1906, Carion lost. Just unreal stuff. So the Virginia Philatelist gave Georges a full page in their December 1897 issue to explain himself again. Of course, he rambled on and said he wanted to embody points that seemed to have gone overlooked. Of course, Georges. The same month, Clifford Kissinger printed another endorsement of Carion, this time with the words, "He is a man of great ability, is well educated, and has many friends." Well, we should all be so lucky, shouldn't we? Georges continued to operate business as usual. Here's a registered mail cover from September 1897. And here's one from October 1897. This has 4-cent double first-class postage and a let's see, an 8-cent registry fee. And that recipient was another stamp dealer. Over the years, Carion had built up a decent amount of goodwill. Many well-respected people in the greater philatelic community, collectors and dealers alike, stood by Georges regardless of the evidence presented against him. And in the spring of 1898, the May to be exact, the Virginia Journal published a list of philatelists who protested the injustice done to Carion, most of who were APA members. You know, I'd like to add here that in the last 12 years, I've gone through about 70,000 pages of those 1880s and 1890s stamp journals, page by page. And I've only heard of two of the people that's listed in this article here. Only two names, Clifford Kissinger and Herbert Beardsley. Now, I will say that most of the names I was exposed to were dealers, so maybe the others on this list were private collectors. Maybe Carion had a mailing list, and these are folks that bought from him. I don't know, but that just seemed kind of like a red flag to me. In early 1898, Carion traveled to Paris. Here's a cover that he mailed while on that trip, and as you can see, his corner card had the 83 Le Mercier Street address on it, and the cover's reverse is also very nice. Check out the 5 red wax seals with Carion's initials on them, GC. So Georges also had Stanley Gibbons on his side. The Virginia Philatelist noted that the Monthly Gibbons Journal reported that the attack on the San Francisco dealer is severe. Carion had obviously done a decent enough job of proclaiming his innocence, and the UK Journal really bought his stories. Carion didn't shrink from controversy. His advertising campaign continued. This is from the May 1898 Virginia Philatelist, who was happy not to just receive his ad content, but also editorial content. A month later, Georges tried to take the high road by alerting collectors to the existence of 1867 forgeries from Bolivia and continued to operate his mail order business. Now, remember, he also specialized in Bolivia. A month later, then in September, his ad noted that his Paris office had a new address here, 29 Rue Legendre. His reach stretched into Canada, as this October 1898 issue of the Philatelic Advocate shows. Carion's picture was shown north of the border. The publication noted it was a pleasure to show his image for the first time in a Canadian stamp journal. And as Georges paid for a full-page ad, they were happy to give him some positive exposure. And who knows, one of the journalists that journals that he advertised in may have attracted this cover sent to a collector the same month, October 1898. Excuse me. This piece of postal history followed about 4 months later. It was sent to a fellow member of the Canadian Philatelic Association. Carion continued to sell forged overprints of Tahiti and Indochina. This ad is from April 1899. Also, in order to legitimize things, he authored a pseudo-scholarly article in which he discussed several non-existent types of genuine overprints, stamps that didn't exist at all. And this attempt to deceive was thwarted by prominent San Francisco stamp dealer Wilhelm Selshop. He was also publisher of that Philatelic Facts and Fallacies journal that we saw earlier. Now, despite all the ads, philatelic content, as well as dealer and stamp journal endorsements, time has certainly proven Carion's lack of integrity. That's because, in addition to the philatelic storm that Georges caused by the overprint scandal, Carion was involved in additional forging activities. I can tell you that another entire evening could be spent telling the story of U.S. Western Express covers that Georges altered to create rare collectibles. I can show you a few examples here. A large quantity of genuine 1852 to 1860 covers from the Bay Area firm of Tandler and Company wound up in Carion's hands, and most had a printed Wells Fargo franc on them, and they were common items valued at about $0.25. Well, Georges saw an opportunity, and he added multiple fake markings to them thereby creating rare Western covers with multiple hand stamps. And a good number of these covers are addressed to this person, Samuel Grosh. Carion applied a variety of different hand stamps. He sold these for about $5 to $10 a piece back then. Remember, that was about 125 years ago. That'd be the equivalent of a collector spending about $150 or $180 on these things. So anyway, here's another cover to Samuel Grosh. I'm by no means an expert on these items, yet I understand that most are really easy to identify as fakes because they represent impossible usages. That is, the two companies whose hand stamps appear on the covers, they did not operate routes that were adjacent geographically. So it means that it wouldn't have been possible for the letter to have been transferred from one line to the other. And eventually, Carion's adventures, they had run their course, and Georges closed up his shop in San Francisco, and he decided to return to Paris, where he resumed his stamp business there. Carion reportedly went home with a superb stock of rare stamps, particularly from Hawaii and Tahiti. And this cover that he sent to Germany in July of 1900 shows his address at 29 Rue Legendre in Paris. There's no mention of Georges being a stamp expert on his corner card there, yet this unused cover with the same address advertises him as an expert and dealer in rare postage stamps. You can see here that Carion also began advertising under the name Georges Carion instead of Georges for a while. And his ads also reflected that for a bit. This is the London Philatelist from December 1901. Here's a nice piece sent to Carion. This is in my collection. This is from the following fall. 3 centavos paid the overseas rate. The postcard was mailed from Guatemala in, October 8th of 1902. It went by ship to New York. It finally arrived in Paris about 3 weeks later on October 31st. The handwritten message on the back is an older form of German, which I'd love to somehow get translated. I'd have to find someone that knew old German and could also read the handwriting, but that would be fun. In 1904, this French collector's journal, La Revue Française de Collectionneurs, printed glowing words about Carion. And I wonder if Georges had sweet-talked the editor, because the publication reported that Mr. Georges Carion is not only a distinguished philatelist, he's also a conscientious writer and also successful researcher. He produced a large number of scientific studies of the highest interest, reproduced by a host of newspapers. He's made a specialty of stamps from the French colonies, of which he has a very varied assortment, and which he is the first to have specialized. His collection from Tahiti contains very rare and extremely little known varieties. Perhaps one day we will have the pleasure of giving the first glimpse of them to our readers. And the article didn't mention anything about his dubious activities of the 1890s, but it did say that he had a great collection of rare stamps from Hawaii and the French colonies, especially Tahiti, of course. This 1907 edition of Luck's Guide, that's the translation there, showed how well Carion's mail order business was doing. The journal had a small ad near the front and 3 terrific full-page ads scattered throughout the publication. These are the type of things that would catch my eye. They also show that he had moved to 21 Rue Nolette in Paris, and he would stay there for several decades. And one of the nicest pieces of Carion postal history that I've ever found was mailed at the end of 1907, and it arrived in Bavaria in January of 1908. I love the triangular Carion advertising sticker on the reverse with the phrase "rare stamps for collectors." So I'm just adding that to my collection, actually. Luck's yearbook, issued in 1908, had a nice ad for his business in Paris. And this appeared in another German publication the following year, 1909. That's the final Carion advertisement that I've ever been able to uncover. Yet it's obvious that he still operated his mail order business for quite some time. Prospective collector received this cover in 1916, and inside was a signed typed letter on business stationery. I wonder if Georges was also selling coins. Also included in this mail out were a number of interesting carry-on price lists. It's possible that maybe he built up a mailing list of collectors to contact regularly rather than placing ads in stamped journals. This is a cover from 1920 that was obviously provided to customers to use when ordering from Georges. And finally, in 1926, Carion sent this registered cover to a very affluent collector who lived about 250 miles or so southwest of Paris. There's no return address on it, yet it pictures Cochin Chin stamp and slogan, "The rarest duty stamps in the world are Cochin China stamps." And if that's not proof enough of who sent this gem, then the sealing wax on the reverse certainly confirms it. How interesting that throughout much of his philatelic career, it was frequently reported that some of what that man sold were items of his own manufacture. Many discerning collectors would interpret that as meaning once a forger, always a forger. And today, with time and overwhelming evidence, we know that Georges Carion was a philatelic fraud to the end. Thank you so much for your time and attention here. As always, I'm delighted to have been able to share another fun philatelic story with you. I'm always happy to answer any questions and hear any comments that you might have. So I will stop the share here if I can. There we go. Thank you again.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes. Always interesting. So he never really got into too much trouble, it seems like, as far as you can tell.
You're right. There weren't many consequences for Georges. He kind of skated right through these episodes he had and caused.
Mm-hmm. Well, folks, do you have questions for Rick? Yeah, Bob?
I have a comment. Can you hear me okay?
Just fine.
I have seen and I own I've seen up to about 30 postcards from the California Midwinter Exposition mailed to Georges Carion, and I think he bought probably a sheet of Colombian stamps and
Wow.
mailed them to his San Francisco office, his Paris office, and mailed them to his wife. And he probably sold them later.
Fascinating. And where are the postcards now?
Well, I mean, I can show one. I mean, mine, this is like from, I think, June or something, or no, this was October.
Fascinating.
Um, the reason why I think it's important is because it was a postcard, a private postcard, and he paid 1 cent Colombian printed matter rate. It's the first time ever that I've seen a printed matter rate on a card for 1 cent. You could send it for 1 cent if you just had your name and address and no other message. So he paid 1 cent. So he obviously knew the rates. And that's how collectors kind of like started exchanging cards. Instead of paying the 5 cent rate, they paid 1 cent and only wrote their name and address.
I see. So it was a way to circulate his mailing address.
Well, I'm not sure if he was accumulating these things because he was mailing them to himself.
Huh.
So I don't think I was thinking he was accumulating these to kind of like trade or sell or whatever. But for me, the key issue is it's the first time that card collectors used 1 cent.
Gotcha.
And that caught on around the turn of the century when cards became, very popular and people were exchanging them all over the world. So just wanted as an FYI.
That's fascinating. So maybe he knew that that being the first time that they would have collectible value, or who knows, maybe he was going to overprint them.
I mean, he could sell them for a dime or a nickel, just pennies on the dollar or whatever.
Great stuff. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
Hey, Rick, this is Eric.
Yes.
A question. You mentioned his forgeries or dealing, I should say, in Hawaiian stamps, and that's an area of interest for me. And of course, the missionary stamps from Hawaii have great value, and there's a number of forgeries of those floating around out there. Do you have examples of his forgeries of any of those stamps, the Hawaiian stamps?
I don't. I will check the folder where I have my research and see if there's any further either information or pictures about those. Thanks for letting me know that because I do recall you collect that. Aaron.
Yeah, it sure be interesting because I've in fact purchased forgeries intentionally,
Uh-huh.
so that I can use them as reference. I can't quite afford the actual ones.
I'd love to see them.
Rick,
I'm
you
sorry?
mentioned the one employee that he had in San Francisco. Did he have a staff? I mean, to put out all these publications and letters and price lists?
Good
Anything about how his business was run?
You know, I'm going to make a note to do a little deep dive on the carry-on employee and get back to you on that. Um, you know, I'm sometimes when I'm doing the gathering information and research, like when I get a cover, I will make sure that I Google the name of the recipient or sender, and I should do that as well for that fella too, because maybe there's more information he could provide one way or another on George.
Yeah, yeah. Because, you know, thinking of our past president, a lot of his ex-employees are there testifying one way or the other. And you wonder if Carion had any of those.
Sure.
The friends you want to keep close by.
The amount, you know, there were so many stamp journals of that era, but I gotta say there was probably 75% of them were from maybe Chicago eastward. The it's a little tougher to find journals of active communities. You know, in there's Denver, Rocky Mountain. There's some West Coast, but it's not a lot. I think maybe newspapers.com might have um, a little more success, hopefully, at that time. But a lot of these tales don't make it into the conventional press.
Yeah, yeah. You know, having seen one from Nebraska, which you showed, you know, having lived there, I was glad to see that. Did you find, as you look through all of these old publications, do many of them have decent shelf lives, or do they go out of business after a few volumes or issues?
I think that one slide that I showed at the beginning, go back to that one. Where's Carion? And you know, the one that said that there were four 400 things at once. There was a I'm going to refer to it right here. Okay, it says 400 different philatelic journals published in the US to 1893, 87 papers issued but one number, 43 issued but two, and 22 papers that have issued between 25 and 50 numbers. So when you ask about shelf life, yeah, that's you know, there are certain ones. It took good editing. I will say that what happened a lot is that there were really a lot of most of these editors were young too. They would be maybe 19 to 24 range, and they would get excited and put out you know, a publication, but essentially they would sell the publication either to their printer or another editor. And sometimes they would keep it up. Sometimes they would incorporate all the content into one. Essentially, someone might have bought the publication simply for the mailing list.
Yeah, I remember for a few summers when I was going up to APS for their summer session, they would have kind of fire sales of things where they had doubles, and was able to get a lot of them, and many of them were just, you know, just a few years worth. But,
Yeah.
But if you were good, you still last. You know, Stanley Gibbons and Scott and all that.
Sure. McKeel's. I actually was sorting a box on Monday night here, and I found I don't own a lot of these old journals because they're so accessible from the libraries. But someone gave me a McKeel's from 1895, and not in great condition, but I 12 pages or so. I looked through it, and there's a Carion classified ad in there.
Okay, very good, very good. Thank you. Questions, folks? Other comments
Did
and questions?
Carion have to pay that court fine,
Uh,
that court judgment?
the he didn't pay the one in San Francisco was thrown out because of the letter from Scott's, so that went away. And then when he sued the French people, and it got adjudicated in 1906, it just basically got thrown out. So he probably had legal fees, but I don't believe he was ever had to pay a fine for any.
I thought you said that somebody sued him, and there was a money amount attached.
That was him suing the French stamp journal.
Oh, and he was asking for money, and he didn't get it. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, Rick, you did not see anybody recanting any of their earlier accolades.
No. I mean, it's pretty wild that Clifford Kissinger and then the folks at the Virginia Philatelists, and I guess Stanley Gibbons, they really just continue to support him. And I kind of wonder what Clifford Kissinger would have said, because he lived into the, I don't know, 40s or 50s. And, he was quite a name in philately. And I wonder what he would have said in, subsequent decades about Carion. Once those Western covers came out too, it was just astonishing what he was trying to fake.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Were they all basically fake, kind of rubber stamp items? Did he actually forge any stamps or other labels?
I'm pretty sure they were all the overprints, or he put those markings on covers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
Hey, Rick, something that caught my eye was two of the publications on the Pennsylvania Philatelist Stamp Collecting Magazine. Okay, that's out there. You have it in two separate slides, one with a red cover and another one later on. And just picked up on the addresses. Both of them are in Reading, PA. They look like prominent homes that are those locations. One is on I believe it's 11th Street in Reading, and the other one was 1032 Penn Street. And I wonder if there was any history or anything, or how did you find out that he had I guess he ran advertising in both these magazines, correct? Or
yeah. Well, actually, the way I found him was because when I was doing the research for William B. Hale, even before this, that would have been between 2012 and 2017. I wasn't looking for ads for Carion or any Carion content per se. I was looking for Hale material. And so, Hale was from Massachusetts. He was a prolific advertiser. So I was real conscious of literally guessing what journals were popular at the time and which ones were ongoing, more than just a few issues, and had good editorial content. And, many of the journals did share, they would send their issues to other editors. So sometimes there would be a list of journals in a magazine, and I would definitely keep that, Xerox that page, because then I could check out those journals from the APRL. And so this one here, the Pennsylvania Philatelist, was certainly on that list because Kissinger was he was known all over the place, and he did a good job in this wasn't his only journal that he did. He sold it, he did another one and whatever. And so that's kind of how I wound up coming across it. There would have been probably in the same issues that had Carion content, had some Hale content. And then I went back to those bound journals again when I was looking for information on Carion. But I sense if you say that you're familiar with that address, that's really cool, because I would imagine that Carion Kissinger may have had his office there or lived there. He was a well-to-do fella.
Yeah, it looked like at one time it was an upscale neighborhood, especially if you went back to that era. The way the row homes or townhomes, just the facades on the front and stuff like that. Today they look, weathered or worn down. At least the one does, but I'm sure at the time they were beautiful. It was a beautiful street, probably. Reading was a prominent town during that time period. It was an age of uh, uh, like a Renaissance period was going on in Pennsylvania, from the railroad and the steel and coal mines and things like that at that time. So
How
yeah,
far is Reading from Lancaster?
it's right up above us. So
Half an hour, an hour?
half an hour, I'd say. Yeah.
Jeez. I'm gonna drive through there sometime.
When you do your field trip, Rick, in August, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because if you're going to New York, you can go up there by Route 61 to Reading, Cat 70, you'll be good.
That'd be great.
Hey, Rick, this
Yeah.
is Lou.
Nice to see you again, Lou.
I just want to say again, your ability to weave a story is what you could tell me anything. It doesn't have to be philatelic, and I certainly appreciate that. I do have a question. Listening to this presentation and some of the other ones, today, it's very easy to see stamps, get stamps. People have a little more disposable income. And I think back in that time period, and I'm thinking to myself, do you have any concept, Rick, of like what kind of money these guys could have made, on pennies or, like you say, I mean, to me, it seems like it would be, it takes time to send mail back then. You send it on approval. Somebody sent you back, 14 cents or 15 cents. I always wonder how, if you had any sense of what kind of money these dealers were making.
I guess the way I'd answer that would probably be it's probably all over the place. And I think, I can see, I have a list of probably maybe 10 of these names, Hale, Carion, Grimmel, like Ennie, Carter, Woolsaver, all these fellows that ran ads that interest me because I collect their postal history. It's not very expensive. EF Gams, all these folks, and I sense that some of them were probably affluent, but I can tell you I've come across some that have gone bankrupt after they had advertised for years and years, and so you would think that after that much effort, you'd be generating enough money to keep it going. But I don't know. The only thing that I do see frequently in the journals is who has the biggest collection in the country, and the biggest collection in the world is now so and so, and they sold this for $100,000, which was probably like $1 million today or something. That type of thing. I see those notes frequently, but I don't get a sense of. I wish I did. It's a great question of how affluent they are. Now I can say that I can get a little bit of that from reading the bios. Kissinger's journal did a wonderful job, as did a few others, in every month having a philatelic bio, usually of a dealer, sometimes of a collector, and they would have this, like we saw the Carion picture that was a photo, and then they did a drawing of it, but they would have an image of someone, and they would tell what their background is. And I sense that a lot of those people they're young folks that are, it's like they're wearing tuxedos. They came from well-off families. You didn't get in there if you were, carrying pails of oats and feeding the horses,
Right.
But I wish I could be a little more specific, but I'll keep it on my radar.
It just seemed, they had, like all of your presentations, these guys had storefronts, different locations,
Yeah.
prominent buildings, public advertising in all these publications. And I'm thinking, even back then, it had to cost a substantial amount of money in the time period.
Sure.
So, and I'm thinking, geez, how did these guys make any kind of money to keep up? And like you said, every time you see these guys, they're in tuxedos or hi-hats or I'm thinking, wow, that must have been a lucrative business back then.
Well, the good guys, they're the ones that I probably answered about, because the bad guys, hey, they didn't have much cost of inventory, did they?
Yeah.
They just made it up.
And some of the stamp dealers might have gone bankrupt for other non-philatelic investments that they made. I think to be a stamp dealer, you have to have a little bit of entrepreneurship and a little bit of risk taking when you buy lots and things.
Sure. When I was a kid, many of you might know, I worked in a stamp store for 3 years, and Jerry never got rich doing that. I saw him when my 8th grade stamp club teacher took us to his basement, and he had one display cabinet, a bunch of stock books, and a bar stool that you could then buy things, sit in and buy things out of. And eventually he got a storefront in Orchard Park, but he did it always as a labor of love. And I'm sure now and then something came in the store, either stamps or coins that fell in his lap, so to speak. But they were there, and there's other businessmen I know in Buffalo. There were stamp dealers that were hardcore and big time moneymakers. In fact, the fellow that sold my dad and I my very first stamp album, the Liberty album in 1968, he just sold his business right during the pandemic and passed away last year. So he had a great run.
Mm-hmm. And the American Stamp Dealer Association has their kind of honor roll of dealers over the years. And I think you can get, if you ever wanted, you go way back, through the years and pick up bios there as well.
Thank you. That would be the American Stamp Dealer, ASDA.
ASDA, yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay,
and
cool.
many of the honorees with some of the APS awards were dealers as well.
I see.
Like Klein was one. Those kind of people.
I'm familiar with the APS Hall of Fame, but I didn't know the ASDA had a list as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. We do. What else, folks? What do we have? This is one of our longest Q&A sessions. It always says a lot. So,
well, again, thank you all. It takes. I think I figured there was 200 hours in this compilation, and what you heard tonight actually is going to come out as an article, because once I compiled it, I love presenting it to whoever wants to hear it, and but I also hope that it ripples out a little ways. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity for you to invite me here, because it provides the end result of doing all that work. And I've got Tim Healy coming up in the fall. I got some really cool stuff there. And then next spring, a year from now, will be Elmer Long. And I want to do the Paris Bourse, but there's so much more involved. It kind of like this one. There's a lot of translating involved, and there's a lot of philatelic work to do besides researching. So that can will get kicked down the road.
Yeah, well, whenever you want to try something out, we're here.
Thanks so much.
Thank you again. That was wonderful. Thank you. One of our noted storytellers and historian in so many areas. So thank you. Very